Sergey, today we're going to start with the lie about the assassination attempt on Putin and his residence in Altai. I think you've already answered this question many times. What interests me is that it's a lie. At this point, neither of us has any doubt about that. I never doubted it for a second. I want to ask you, why do you think this story was so poorly put together by the Russian special services? Because first of all, it doesn't stand up to any criticism. And second, if you really think about it, it actually works in Ukraine's favor. Because let's be honest, it sounds pretty ridiculous when the leader of one nuclear power calls up the leader of another nuclear power to complain and whine. And he's complaining that Ukraine, a non-nuclear country he thought he could capture in 2 days, is misbehaving and keeping him up at night in his Valdai residence. It all looks pretty undignified for Putin. And for his imperial ambitions, you have to admit.
Here we need to separate two perspectives. The perspective of how it looks to us, to normal people, and how it looks to that old creep Trump. Unfortunately, there's a huge difference here, and this whole story really wasn't meant for us, but rather it was intended for Trump. And for us, for people like us, it simply didn't work at all, because there were a lot of inconsistencies throughout, starting with Lavrov talking about 91, the drone that supposedly headed toward this so-called Putin residence. Although the Russian General Staff said that on that day there were only 89 drones across the entire Russian Federation, about 18 of them in the region in question. But the conversation isn't really about us. And not about normal people either, but about that old geezer Trump, who this whole story actually worked on, unfortunately. Because you saw his reaction when he said, well, to me, Putin told me about it. How did I find out about this? Putin told me about it. And he said it as if God himself had come down from heaven and told him this very story. He answered just about the same way as he did in July 2018. He answered when he was asked, was there Russian interference in the 2016 election? He said there wasn't because Putin told me so. I asked Putin to his face, and Putin told me to my face. But you and I know that Putin lied to his face. And to that old fart, that old idiot, he lied. But Trump said it, as if it was some kind of revelation from above. After that, there was a huge scandal. A former governor of California, Schwarzenegger, called Trump a traitor at the time, because a person who says, I trust Putin more than my own intelligence agencies, is someone who is not a patriot of the United States of America. And Trump had to apologize for it, had to take back his words, saying, you misunderstood me. I meant to say that Putin didn't tell me that. That's not what I said. In other words, he lied so much that he himself no longer knew how to justify himself. But here he said, Putin told me this, and I believe him. It followed from this that this was not normal. And then he continued his thought. He said, you see, I didn't give Ukraine tomahawks, and it was the right thing not to give them, because God forbid if I had given them, they would have struck that residence, not with drones, but with my tomahawks. So in reality, all this idiotic Putin-style ornamentation, which wouldn't work on any normal person, but it worked on Trump, unfortunately.
I don't see how it worked, Sergey. Trump didn't come out and say, I'm going to stop giving Ukraine intelligence. Trump didn't come out and say, I'm going to stop selling weapons to Europe, which it will then pass on to Ukraine. I don't see any formal benefit, except perhaps that Russia has gained an unofficial right to strike the government quarter in Kyiv. Yeah.
That's the most important thing. And that's the most important thing, because you understand that all those people who spoke out on this topic, they planted this whole idea in our heads and in the minds of people around the world, so that the next time they strike the government quarter and kill Zelensky, and God forbid someone else as well, they can say it was in response to the alleged assassination attempt on Putin. After all, that's the only reason this was done. And most importantly, so that Trump, at that point too, well, I can agree with you here that even though Trump, so to speak, handed all the cards to Putin, he still didn't take anything away from Ukraine. By the way, it's not a fact that he didn't take anything away. You're being a bit disingenuous, because he said, so to speak, this will make me reconsider my relationship with Zelensky. This will make me reconsider my approach to negotiations with Zelensky. That's what Trump said. So it worked. So far, he hasn't reconsidered anything. On this point, I agree with you. But the narrative has already been set. And the most important narrative is that when the Russian Federation, Putin is surely preparing a strike, a massive one against Ukraine from December 31st to January 1st. And he'll say, this is our revenge for the assassination attempt on me. And Trump also said another important phrase. He said that yes, when Ukraine strikes military targets, that is considered to be normal behavior. But when it's Putin's house, that's not normal, Trump said. He actually said all of this. So he gave his assessment of this non-existent terrorist attack. He didn't say. But the most important thing is what Trump didn't say, and unfortunately that works against us. He didn't say, yes, Putin told me this, but it still needs to be verified. I would call in my CIA director right now. I would call him the Director of National Intelligence of the United States, Tulsi Gabbard. And I would ask them to clarify this information, to make sure that everything that Putin told me is true. But Trump didn't say this, and that's the most important thing.
But the main thing is that the questions are being asked by American journalists. You have intelligence agencies, and you can consult with them, and that also narrows the room for these theatrical antics. It all looked very, honestly, comical and cynical because Trump was standing there during his speech with Netanyahu talking about striking Putin's house. Yeah, why specifically a house? That's unclear. And you can't do that. This is Trump who signed the order, or at least gave the verbal command, to destroy the same thing. Soleimani, the general. And as for Netanyahu, well, there it's just a constant stream, has been and will be, of eliminating all of Israel's enemies, right? These people. They themselves gave the orders to attack their enemies. But that's just by the way, as they say. What do you think? Was this special operation only a Russian one? Wasn't there already a tandem at work here? Putin and Trump? Wasn't there some kind of collusion between them?
Now, that's a very interesting question. It really is a very interesting question. As for him standing next to Netanyahu, that's actually his old way of doing things. He's done that more than once before. He comes over, you remember when Maloney was sitting with him, and he spent a long time talking about some internal American issues. She was just yawning, staring at the ceiling, because, well, obviously discussing internal American issues in front of a foreign leader is nonsense. It's just bad form. But Trump and bad form are like two peas in a pod, so it's no surprise that Trump is guilty of bad form. No surprise at all. But the question you asked is actually a serious one. We actually started thinking about it even earlier than you might expect, and in a pretty definite and concrete way too. Because remember, when President Zelensky was flying back and forth between the United States and his home country, at a certain point there was talk, or at least some discussion, that he was supposed to meet or perhaps even cross paths with Witkoff. This was something that people were paying close attention to, and it became a topic of conversation among those following the situation closely. He was coming back from Russia, so Zelensky was heading back to Europe, and Witkoff was going back to the United States, and they were supposed to cross paths in Ireland. And when President Zelensky's plane was gradually approaching the country of Ireland, he was actually quite lucky in the sense that he was ahead of his planned schedule, because just a bit later, at the very moment when he was originally supposed to be approaching Ireland, suddenly out of nowhere, 4 rather large and imposing drones appeared in the sky, which were, so to speak, right in the flight path of this plane. And there was suspicion that they had been launched there by the Russians to shoot down Zelensky's plane or to interfere with it in some way, and so on and so forth. And the person who reported that Zelensky would be arriving at that exact time, at that exact place, was Witkoff. There was no one else there, because he was supposed to meet with him. And by the way, Witkoff didn't show up for that meeting. He canceled it. Apparently, he leaked information about Zelensky's plane to the Russians. So your suspicion, and the suspicion you mentioned in your question, is quite justified.
But I suspected them of political collusion. And from your words, it follows that the same Utkov may be working for the Russian Federation's special services with the aim of eliminating Ukrainian President Zelensky. Witkoff.
Like, directly to the special services of the Russian Federation and to the president of the Russian Federation. This became clear from the leaks of the negotiations. But unfortunately, you and I are living in a moment when in the United States of America, in the normal United States of America, This would have ended, at the very least, with the dismissal of the CIA director, and in an even more normal United States of America, it would have ended with his arrest and being charged with treason. Under Trump, it ended with Trump telling him, well, he just had to sell out Ukraine to Russia the right way. Trump said the phrase he was supposed to sell Ukraine to Russia. And that's exactly why he could use any and all means necessary to achieve his goals. He's not what I would call a geopolitician. To me, rather, he's more like a real estate salesman. And apparently, that's how he did real estate deals in New York. That's just how these United States of America are set up. Yeah, that's the kind of system we have to live in.